All right, it is 2 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the next installment in the webinar series, Unpacking PREA, the North Carolina approach to victim services behind bars. Today's webinar is focused on the PREA Victim Services Standard. Next slide, please. Tara, are you able to go to the next slide? Or Lisa, whichever. I think it's Tara. I'll go ahead and keep going while we figure out the slides. My name is Gabriella Nyman. I'm the Training and Communication Specialist with NC CASA, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Okay, so before we start our webinar, here is some basic information about NC CASA. We are, okay, third slide, please. Here, we'll go ahead and wait for our PowerPoint to want to work, especially during this time. Technical difficulties, pretty common, at least for me.
Sorry about that, Gabriella. I apologize. I had some audio technical difficulties. So I guess we're ready to move to the next slide.
Yeah.
Got it. There we go.
So I already introduced myself, so we could go ahead and go to slide 3. Thank you.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you. NC CASA, we are an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. We use a social justice framework. Therefore, our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. By centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone is served. Some of our work includes the Training Institute, including our online learning module, supporting rape crisis centers, resource sharing and technical assistance, legislative and policy work, anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, working with colleges and universities, and providing access to language services. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We are using Zoom for the webinar series. I'm sure many of you are living on Zoom these days, but just want to make sure that you know how to work things on Zoom webinar. All participants are muted throughout. Please enter any discussion responses in the chat box at the bottom of your screen as shown in the slide. We will have time for questions at the end, but feel free to ask them at any time. You can submit a question in the Q&A button, and I will be keeping an eye on them throughout, along with Courtney Dunkerton, who is also one of our NC CASA staff. We will have polls throughout. These will be shown on your screen, and you will be able to enter your response. The webinar will be recorded. A recording will be posted on NC CASA's website in the coming days, along with resources mentioned in this webinar. If you have trouble with Zoom, please email me at gabriella@nccasa.org, and it is on the screen. And next slide, please. NC CASA is pleased to bring you this webinar series. Originally, NC CASA was hosting regional trainings throughout North Carolina. We completed the second of 3 trainings days before the statewide stay-at-home orders went into place for COVID-19. As a result, we pivoted and decided to provide a series of webinars focused on the same topics covered during the in-person training. We are excited to offer the training in this way. Today, our presenters will provide an overview of PREA's Victim Services Standard Requirements. It is a foundational webinar from which the rest of the series will be built. We encourage you to join us for the other webinars in this series. You can register for them on our NC CASA website. After today's webinar, we will have 3 more webinars on Tuesdays in June. Next slide, please. We will then have 3 webinars on Tuesdays in July to finish out this series. And the other 3 webinars for July are listed on there. Next slide, please. More specifically, today's webinar will provide an overview of the criminal justice system and who is incarcerated nationally with specifics on North Carolina. Information will be provided about rates of sexual abuse in confinement settings and how that information led to the creation of the PREA standards. The presenters will provide an overview of the PREA standards and an in-depth look at the Victim Services Standards. We will also have an interview presentation from Melinda Ingram and their involvement with implementing these standards. Next slide, please. I would like to introduce you to our presenters for the webinar. Tara Graham, she, her, hers, Senior Program Director at Just Detention International. Tara spent nearly 14 years working on the development and implementation of the PREA standards. Lisa Cook, she, her, hers, Jail Consultant for NC CASA. Lisa is the former Buncombe County Jail PREA Coordinator and was a DOJ Certified PREA Auditor. In her work with NC CASA, she assists in creating trainings in partnership with NC CASA and other agencies. She is the co-author of the North Carolina Approach, Creating and Navigating New Relationships to Better Serve Incarcerated Survivors of Sexual Assault, a resource we will introduce in the webinar series. I will now hand over the webinar to Tara.
Great, thank you, Gabriella. While Lisa and I enjoy training in person, this series is a tremendous opportunity for us to still provide this valuable information. I work for Just Detention International, or JDI, a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. This webinar series is a perfect example of how JDI carries out its mission. Other ways that we carry out our mission include working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and by supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. At the heart of all that we do, we believe that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. Please practice self-care. And what I mean by this is to make sure that you pay attention to what you need in the moment. Think of this like what you do to relax. It might be to take a walk, read a book, play a sport. The possibilities are endless. Obviously, with a live webinar, we hope that you stay tuned in, but we will be talking about sexual violence and hearing from survivors of sexual abuse that took place in confinement settings. The goal is not to upset you, but to connect the facts and figures to real people. This may be upsetting to you. Pay attention to how this affects you, or if you will find it upsetting, be sure to step away and rejoin us when you are able. When we play a video, we will let you know how long it will be so you can step away and put your speakers on mute until it is over. If you are watching a recording, you can pause and take a break or even fast forward past the video. Like Gabriella said, today's webinar will provide an overview of PREA and more specifically the Victim Services Standards. But before we get there, we want to provide an overview of the criminal justice system. This will help us all to have a similar understanding of who is incarcerated nationally and more specifically, what this looks like in North Carolina. We will then narrow our focus to the issue at hand, sexual abuse in confinement settings. We will share national and North Carolina specific data. So let's get started. First, we want to know who is joining us today. So we have a few questions to learn more about you and whether or not there are victim advocacy services being provided. Gabriella, can you launch the first poll? Great. So if everyone who's joining us today, if you can take a moment to tell us where you work. Are you with a victim advocacy organization like a rape crisis center or domestic violence sexual abuse center? Are you with a North Carolina jail, with a North Carolina prison, or you're from somewhere else? Let us know. How are we doing, Gabriella? Are we ready to show the poll results?
So we have had around 22 people enter their data for the poll. So if you're ready, we can end it.
That sounds good.
Okay. And then are you able to see the poll?
I am not able to see the poll, no. Can you just tell us what the results are?
Yeah, of course. So
perfect.
Advocacy Organization, Rape Crisis Center, or DVSA centers, 68% of our participants, 0 from a North Carolina jail, 0 from North Carolina prison, and 32% from other.
Great, thank you everyone. From those of you that are from other, if you could take a moment and write into the chat where you're from, we'd love to hear where you're coming to us from. And while you do that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next poll. And this is just to tell us, for those of you that are providing services to survivors in confinement, or if there is anyone joining us that's from a correctional facility, tell us about the services that you are providing to individuals. So Gabriella, go ahead and launch this poll, and then we'll take a look. We'll look back to the chat box and see what folks have said.
Okay, the poll is now launched.
Great, and how are we doing on responses?
We have 14 of 29.
Okay, so if folks could just take a minute and answer the polling question, and then we'll see what results we have.
All right, it looks like we have 19 out of 30. So if you would like, we can end the poll unless you want to wait a little bit longer.
Why don't we go ahead and end the poll and see what folks have said, and then we can see what people entered into the chat box about where they're from.
Okay, awesome. So it looks like my agency provides services to incarcerated survivors in a jail or prison, 33% of people. My facility has victim advocates who provide services, 43% of the people. My agency does not work with incarcerated survivors, 19% of people. My facility does not work with victim advocates, 5% of people.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful, everyone. Thank you for sharing that. And then what additional information did people share in the chat about where they're from?
So we have quite a few people. We have people from DVSA agencies, sexual assault response coordinators for Fort Bragg. We have some of our NC CASA staff here, NC Council for Women and Youth Involvement, the Education Public School System, Family Service of the Piedmont, and another victim advocate from the Army, Family Crisis Council, Rowan County, MCAS New River. So in the chat box that are the people, those are the people that responded to our previous question.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for joining us again today. It's great to have a diverse group joining us. Lisa, I'm going to hand things over to you, and just because it seemed to be a little bit strange, why don't I just advance the slides for you? So just tell me when you want me to move to the next slide. So let me get you to your first slide here. There you go, Lisa.
Hello, everybody. Today, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great. Thank you.
Awesome. I think my connection might not be the best here. So I wanted to give everyone a bit of a background of what a jail is versus a prison. And I know we do have the majority of individuals participating in this webinar today are from the advocacy side. So jails are typically going to be county or locally operated. So in North Carolina, we have 100 counties. We've got a little over 90 jails that are operated predominantly by the sheriffs. Some agencies are operated in conjunction with other counties as a joint jail. Most are individual single counties. We're looking at a jail is going to operate short stays. Individuals are in and out oftentimes, at least for Buncombe County, you're looking at an average of a couple weeks stay, versus prisons where individuals were sentenced, they're going to stay a much longer period of time. Predominantly, we've got misdemeanor convictions in the jails. So these individuals, misdemeanors are going to be housed in the jails for anyone who's sentenced. In the state of North Carolina, we have what's called the State Misdemeanor Confinement Program. And that situation allows for jails to hold sentenced prisoners in our jails rather than sending them to other prisons. We also have individuals that have just been arrested or on temporary holds. We're looking at things like maybe a 24-hour hold where someone was intoxicated or doesn't have a sober person to pick them up. They're waiting for arraignment. They haven't had their opportunity to go before a judge. Maybe they've just been before a magistrate. Oftentimes, these jails are set up as single sex, especially in the case of smaller jails in North Carolina. A number of jails, because of our statutes, require that jails house by sex and separately. So for some of those smaller jails, it may be just for males versus having males and females. We do have, like we said, with those short stays, we're going to have a higher population turnover. Now with misdemeanors, we could house individuals that were being sentenced from a DUI for a much longer period of time, where we are talking about years, or individuals who are awaiting maybe a more serious offense, murder trials, things of that nature, might end up being housed for a much longer period of time. Now these jails vary widely in size. We have everything from 15-bed jails to thousands, depending on the county in which the jail resides. So we do have quite a variety. We also have a variety of physical plant structure. That's going to add in whether we have a jail that has different dormitories. You can think of that like bunk style beds that you might see at summer camp. However, this is definitely not summer camp. And you do have the opportunity to have jails that are a pod structure that have individual rooms outside of those. Again, they are going to vary. And in North Carolina, we have an average size of about 200 for all of our jails. If you could advance to the next slide, please. On the other side, we do have prisons. Remember, I said that jails house individuals that have not been adjudicated necessarily, found guilty of a crime, unless they are misdemeanants that are being housed with that state misdemeanor confinement program here in North Carolina, or if they are a shorter stay misdemeanor. Now, if you are found guilty of a felony, you will be housed in a state prison. That would be, for North Carolina, the Department of Public Safety. These facilities, again, prisons can be state or federally operated, and I failed to mention previously, jails may house federal inmates. Again, that's a different situation. We'll touch on that a little bit later. These, of course, are going to be much longer stays. These facilities have been built to accommodate for inmates or prisoners that will be there for longer stays, those convicted felons, years at a time. These are going to be single-sex facilities. So rather than having different units that have male and female, these areas will be just a male prison versus the jail that has both male and females. You're going to have various security levels, whereas a jail must house all security levels within one's facility. A prison system, especially a statewide prison system, will have multiple locations that vary in security levels. You might have a maximum security facility that's one building, one campus, and then you'll have another facility somewhere else within the state that might be medium security. So these are going to be separate from jails. You're also going to get a lot more job programming and educational opportunities. The sheriffs of North Carolina are not required to provide these opportunities. It is entirely up to each sheriff of each county if they would like to have any type of job opportunities or programs from the outside or from the community, or even educational opportunities like GED programs. Those are completely up to the behest of the sheriff of each county that runs each jail, whereas a prison system has more programming available to all of the prisoners on site, and also looking more at reintegrating the individuals that reside there back into the community. And we will emphasize throughout our webinars that we have to keep in mind that these individuals, the vast majority of individuals that are incarcerated will be released back into the community. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Tara.
So now that we have a better understanding of the differences between prisons and jails, let's look at rates of incarceration in the United States. A note on the information we will share. With the onset of COVID-19, jurisdictions across the nation have been releasing low-level offenders and individuals who have underlying health conditions or who are elderly and at increased risk for negative outcomes in contracting the virus. These numbers are constantly fluctuating, so what we present today are based on data that was accurate prior to the pandemic. In 2009, there were over 2 million people incarcerated at any given time. Keep in mind, the jails have large percentages of their populations change each and every day. So the actual number of people who pass through our nation's prisons and jails each year is much, much higher. Annually, across the nation, there are over 10.6 million jail admissions. That's enough people to fill prison buses stretched bumper to bumper from San Francisco to New York City. As you can also see from this graphic, it's not just that people are in prison or jail. There are also significant numbers of people who are on probation or parole as a condition of their sentence. When you look more broadly at who is incarcerated, it is clear that mass incarceration in the US has had a damaging and disproportionate effect on communities of color and low-income communities. More than 90% of prisoners are men. More than 60% are people of color. Among all incarcerated men and women, more than half are parents. In fact, 1 in 43 children has a parent in prison, and more than half of all prison and jail inmates have a mental health problem. It is also worth noting that half or more of prisoners who have been convicted are serving time for a nonviolent crime, and the gap is even greater in federal prison and in jails. Let's spend a few minutes looking a bit more closely at what we know about who is incarcerated through the lens of lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. For men in general, the likelihood of imprisonment is at some point is 1 in 9. That differs based on race. So for white men, 1 in 17 will face imprisonment across their lifetime. But when we look at Black men, it's 1 in 3, and Latino men, 1 in 6. What this means is that in 2012, Black men were 6 times and Latino men 2.5 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men. To put this in perspective, author and civil rights advocate Michelle Alexander pointed out that in 2011, there were more African American men in prison or jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850 before the Civil War began. There are also disproportionalities for women. For all women, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment is 1 in 56. For white women, this is actually 1 in 111. For Black women, it's 1 in 18, and for Latino women, 1 in 45. I'll hand things back over to Lisa to talk to us about what we see in North Carolina. Lisa?
So how many people are in North Carolina's criminal justice system currently? When we look at the criminal justice system, remember, like Tara said, this information is prior to COVID. This is information that was gathered prior to any releases that we've had. There are 160,000 North Carolinian behind bars or in the criminal justice supervision. So the vast majority we do have under probation. We have over 80,000 in probation, and federal inmates, we're looking at 11,000. State prisoners, we have over 36,000 inmates. Tara, could you hold on one? I'm having trouble with my screen and
Certainly.
My connection here. Would you mind taking over this slide, please?
Sure, not a problem. Just let us know when you're back.
Thank you.
Sure, of course. So again, like Lisa mentioned earlier, in North Carolina, there are 96 jails and 53 state prisons. So you can see what this looks like when we break down the numbers. Like Lisa said, there are 160,000 North Carolinians involved in the criminal justice system, and that's out of 10.5 million residents, so about 1.5%. And you can also see from this graphic, in addition to the numbers that Lisa already reviewed, that there are 470 youth that are confined, and the state also has involuntary commitment, which means someone who has firsthand knowledge of someone else who has a mental illness or a substance abuse issue and can actually petition a magistrate to commit someone to treatment. And so then also just looking again at North Carolina, the state has seen an increase in recent years in pretrial detainees, that is, people who have not yet been convicted, while the rates of those convicted and held in local jails has stayed fairly steady. We're gonna go ahead and move in.
Hey, we
Yes,
have a
Lisa.
question from
Sure.
a few slides ago. Does these numbers include the facility of Fort Leavenworth Federal Prison, question mark?
My understanding is that, here, let me go back to that right here, I think is what you meant. So the federal prisons here, it shows it's 11,000 individuals. If that includes Fort Leavenworth, I don't actually know the breakdown of all of the facilities and whether or not that includes military facilities or not. And I apologize that I don't know the answer to that. But I can try to find that out and pass that on to NC CASA. Let's go ahead and turn to our third poll. And this is looking at what we've just, kind of your impressions of what we just shared about rates of incarceration. So take a moment and let us know about what we just shared. How did this surprise you? Did it surprise you that it, is it much higher than you thought? It was somewhat surprising. Or were you not at all surprised? Let us just take a moment and let us see what you have to say. How are we doing, Gabriella?
We currently have 20 of 28 people voting.
Okay, let's give just another little bit and then we'll go ahead and see what people thought.
Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll right now. So very surprised it is higher than I thought, 19% of people. Somewhat surprised it is high, but about what I imagined, 43%. Not at all surprised, I thought it would be higher, 38%. And it looks like we have another question. Do the numbers include youth who are in detention centers?
Yeah, so let me go back to that slide again. Yes, if you look, it's just a small sliver here that this shows on the slide on your screen, that there are about 470 youth in North Carolina that are in detention facilities. What we've seen across the nation is that the rates of juveniles who are held in juvenile detention facilities is decreasing, and that's nationwide, and we continue to see those numbers decrease. Great questions, everyone. Keep them coming. Okay, so now, like I said, we will continue to narrow our focus. So we've talked about the criminal justice system across the US. We've looked at it through the lens of North Carolina. And now we are going to focus on sexual abuse and sexual harassment in confinement settings. The image on your screen are of a public education campaign JDI did several years ago with the goal of bringing to light the importance of providing support services to all survivors, that no matter who they are, where they live, or what they may have done in the past. So with this in mind, based on popular public opinion, who is sexually abused? Place your answers in the chat box and we'll take a look to see what people are saying. So again, take a moment and in the chat box indicate, you know, based on public opinion, who are the people that are sexually abused? And I'll read some of those out as folks put those in. So again, if you can go up to your chat box and just make a little note about who, you know, again, based on public opinion, who experiences sexual violence or sexual abuse. Looks like folks are being a little quiet, which is fine. Continue to keep your, oh great, thank you, Virginia. Sex workers, women, those that are vulnerable, right? And we will have a webinar later in the series that looks at those individuals who are at increased risk. Great, thanks, Robin. LGBTQ+ individuals, right? Any other thoughts? Males that are considered weak. Okay, great, thank you, Kimberly. And impoverished individuals, right? So continue to share those thoughts, definitely. I'm gonna go ahead and move forward. But you're right, so again, thank you for those thoughts, and especially we have so many advocates on with us today. And based on RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, it's estimated that every 96 seconds, someone in the US is sexually assaulted. It's about 1 in 6 females is a victim of an attempt or completed rape during their lifetime, and 1 of 33 males is a victim of attempted or completed rape during their lifetime. Oops. And then with respect to those, what people will often say about who perpetrates sexual violence, what we know is that 7 out of 10 rapes, so 70%, are committed by someone known to the victim or to the survivor. And 45% of these are often an acquaintance, and about 1/4 of those are a current or former spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend. 28% are committed by a stranger. About 6% are committed by more than one person or the victim can't recall. And then it's only about 1% that are committed by a non-spouse relative. So we're gonna, that was information about the community. And so we're gonna be looking at data that looks at rates of sexual victimization in a confinement setting. And so what I want to do before we discuss that is just to give you a little bit of background on the data collection itself. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. One of the requirements of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, is that research is conducted to determine the extent of sexual violence in confinement settings. So as you can imagine, this is a very challenging task. The data that we will discuss is from 2012. So I know it does seem like that was a long time ago, and it was, but unfortunately that's the most recent data that we have. They are currently undergoing data collection and analysis for adult prisons and jails, the results of which should be available in the coming years. They actually did just recently release data on juvenile facilities in 2019, and I'll show you some of that information shortly. The surveys are structured in such a way that everyone will take the same amount of time to complete the surveys, no matter what they respond. So for example, everyone is asked basic demographic information. This is all done by a computer. And then they are eventually asked if they have experienced sexual abuse in the facility where they're at within the last 12 months. And people who then answer that they have been sexually abused are asked more specific questions about the details of what happened. Who committed it, when, where, how often did it happen, and other factors that played into the abuse. For those individuals who said that they haven't been sexually abused, they are asked additional questions as well, but they're more demographic in nature and about their experiences in confinement. The idea of this approach is to make sure that not any one person stands out as having spent too short or too long a time taking the survey. For example, prisoners who know that the survey is about, they will know that it's about sexual abuse. So someone who takes a really long time before coming back may be thought to have disclosed sexual abuse as compared to someone else who almost immediately returns to their unit. Lastly, the surveys are structured to prevent people from tampering with the data. There are checks and balances that when reviewing or cleaning the data, the researchers are able to identify any surveys that seem not quite right. And then these surveys are ultimately not included in the data reports. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of where the data comes from, let's take a look at what we've learned from it. The data tells us that in a given year, about 200,000 people are sexually abused in confinement settings. The last data collection occurred before the PREA standards were released. It is hoped that facilities have implemented the standards and are now committed to making facilities safer, and that when in the next data collection, when it comes out, that we'll actually see that this number has decreased. The previous graphic was of all prisoners, but for former state inmates, this resulted in a victimization rate of 1 in 10, or about 10%. And when asked about who committed the sexual abuse in detention, in adult facilities, staff are as likely to perpetrate sexual abuse as other inmates. So like I said, the previous juvenile data was from 2012, and they recently released data in 2019 about the most recent surveys, which, as you can see on the bottom of your slide, was actually data collected in 2018. So in the previous data, it was found that, so the 2012 surveys, it was found that 10% of youth experienced sexual abuse while in juvenile detention. But what the 2019 data shows us is that this number has dropped to 7.1%. This is encouraging to see that since the release of the standards, the rate of sexual victimization of youth has decreased almost 30%. Now, there's absolutely room for improvement. We want this to be 0%, but it is certainly improvement nonetheless. And we are hopeful that we will see a similar kind of decrease in the new adult prison and jail data. Lisa, are you able to talk now, or would you like me to?
I am. Thank you.
Oh, okay,
I'm up and running. Great. Thank you so much. All right. So some of the BJS facts about North Carolina. We we looked at some of those prisons and jails across the nation. So these next few slides are going to show the outcomes for the facilities within North Carolina. Remember that not all facilities participated, not all the facilities are asked, and some that are asked refused to participate. So for North Carolina overall, there were 7 prisons and 13 jails that actually did participate. 1 jail, Montgomery County, refused to participate. 2 facilities stand out in the data. Robeson County, who had a rate of staff sexual misconduct of 5.2%, and Mary Frances Center reported 0.0% of any sexual victimization of any kind. The BJS surveys also bring into attention the North Carolina CIW, the women's prison in Raleigh. The rates of victimization are extremely high. As you can see on this slide, overall women reported a rate of 13%, with 11.4% as inmate on inmate sexual abuse. Of this, women reported high rates of physical force and pressure that was part of inmate on inmate sexual violence. I had previously mentioned Robeson County with a high rate of staff sexual misconduct. There are 3 counties that stand out: Robeson, Granville, and Edgecombe. All 3 sites had overall rates of victimization much higher than the national average. You can see with Robeson showing 7.5% overall. On that one, sorry, Tara. Granville, the 6.5%, and Edgecombe being 6.3%.
Sorry about that, Lisa, for advancing.
It's fine.
I know that there's a question here and it says, how many refuse and why? And that's with respect to the federal surveys about refusal. I don't have those rates. I can certainly find them for folks. Not every prison or jail is selected to participate. And then of every population, there is a random sampling of individuals that are asked. The rates of refusal are fairly low from what I recall. It's not something that stood out in terms of willingness to participate in the surveys. It does happen sometimes that an institution, when they are asked to participate in the survey, that they either don't get back or they have refused to participate. So that does happen. Great, so we'll go ahead, keep those questions coming, they're great. And we'll kind of answer them throughout as we are able. And let's just keep going here. Okay, so like we've said before, sexual abuse, no matter the setting, is a tragedy and one that can and should be prevented. The Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed in 2003 in response to this public health emergency. One of the things the legislation required was the development of the PREA standards. This webinar series, as we've mentioned before, will focus primarily on the victim services standards and how corrections and victim advocates can work with one another to provide services to incarcerated survivors. And before I continue, I just want to make a note about terminology that we'll continue to use throughout this webinar and in the other webinars. First, the PREA standards use the words inmate and victims. And while we will use these terms, you will also hear us use prisoners and survivors. In particular, at JDI, we use the term survivor since it is more victim-centered and demonstrates that someone who is sexually abused and survives is a survivor and will heal. It is a more empowering term than calling someone a victim. And for the wide number of advocates that are on with us today, I'm sure that resonates with you. So the goal of the PREA standards is to keep people safe and to completely eliminate sexual abuse and sexual harassment in confinement. The standards also provide a roadmap for how corrections facilities and agencies can work to not only prevent incidents from occurring, but also how to detect, respond, and monitor if an incident should occur. Looking at the standards another way, the standards require corrections facilities to take steps to, first, protect the survivors from those that abuse them, provide survivors multiple ways to report abuse that they have experienced, give survivors access to appropriate emergency and ongoing medical and mental health care, increase staff and agency accountability, and provide access to rape crisis services that are at the same level of care to services as those provided in the community. Implementing the PREA standards is more than just implementing a new policy or procedure. Meaningful, sustained implementation requires a team effort and vigilance to work on implementation each and every day. The hope is that with time, the PREA standards become part of the facility culture and day-to-day operations. JDI has worked with the National PREA Resource Center, a federally funded source for PREA resources, to identify and capture the voices of PREA champions around the nation. I'd like to introduce you to Janitha McNair, the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center. She has worked to implement PREA for many years and will share her leadership perspective about working with the youth and her staff to meaningfully implement the standards. This is a video, and I was having a little bit of difficulty playing it through my through the PowerPoint, so I'm going to switch over to a different screen share. So just bear with me a moment, everyone. And for folks, I encourage you to, I've got my computer speakers turned up, which should help with the audio, but if you can't hear it, I encourage you to increase the volume on your computer. This video, Janitha will talk about her work at her facility specific to PREA.
Hey, Tara, before you shared the screen, did you click the share your computer sound?
I did not. Give me a moment. Do you know where I find that?
So,
sorry, it worked before.
Yeah, when you click the screen, there should be a box that checks share sound from your computer.
I see it. Yep, absolutely. Great. Okay, give me just one moment, everyone. I apologize about that. And I will start again. Here we go.
Janitha McNair. I'm the Executive Director at the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center in Alexandria, Virginia. It's very important to me to ensure that any facility that I'm affiliated with is in keeping with the federal standards as it relates to sexual safety and prison rape elimination. It's so easy to put a policy in place and to hire people to do your staff training and then put posters on the wall. Leadership has to be involved in the information that's being put out to their staff, to their population of residents or inmates or detainees. They have to know what's going on in the trenches. I still make the time to make rounds in my facility to get an idea of the dynamic and to feel the environment. I don't want the staff to shift when I walk in. I don't want them to get up when I walk through the door. I want everybody to stay the same. And when it starts to change because I walked in, then that gives me an indication that maybe I have more work to do with the environment in my facility. To ensure that my kids are safe, I start with the basics. I ask them, do they feel safe? I ask them, what makes them feel safe? I really want to hear feedback of whether they trust communicating with my staff, whether they trust being able to communicate with me. One of the things that drives staff crazy, but that I love, is when my children file grievances. If my kid feels safe enough to complain about the brand of soap, they can complain about everything, but it's those facilities where there's never a complaint or a grievance that gives me concern, because I feel like now that population doesn't feel safe enough to say, I don't like what's going on. I know it's a stretch from soap to sexual safety, right? But when kids can start to advocate on any level about what is fair treatment to them, or whether the environment makes them feel like they're important, then I know we're on the right track. But I want to hear my kids say to me, without ever having to say the exact words, I'm safe here. I'm important here. I'm significant. Somebody cares about me.
Great. So thank you again to Janitha. She, again, is a tremendous leader in the world of corrections and juvenile detention. And it's a pleasure to get to work with her and to hear her perspective on leadership. So I'm pleased to have shown that with you today. We want to just take a quick moment and I think this is our final poll for today, about who is required to implement the PREA standards. Is it only federal and state prisons, all corrections and law enforcement facilities, or is it rape crisis centers and facilities, correctional facilities in their service area? So if participants joining us today could take a few moments to respond, and then we'll move forward. How are we doing, Gabriella?
We have 14 of 28 responses as of right now. I'll go ahead and keep it up until it hits 1 minute and 30 seconds.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have 17 of 27. I'll go ahead and end the poll. So only federal and state prisons, we had 6%. All corrections and law enforcement facilities, 71%. Rape crisis centers and facilities in their service areas, 24%.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabriella. Thank you to all who participated in that. And like Gabriella said, 71% of you all, and I can't do the quick math in my head of how many that actually is. So about 3/4 of you indicated that answer number 2, that all corrections and law enforcement facilities are required to implement the PREA standards. And that's the correct answer. In fact, the PREA standards apply to all confinement facilities, adult prisons and jails, juvenile facilities, community confinement facilities, and lockups. And while there are victim services standards, it is not the responsibility of victim services agencies to comply. Rather, it is the responsibility of the corrections facilities or agencies to work with their local advocacy agency to build a relationship and work collaboratively to find ways to work together to provide services to incarcerated survivors. We will get a deep dive into what this looks like as we go through this entire webinar series. I want to spend a bit more time talking about the standards overall in terms of what is required by corrections facilities. For those of you on the webinar, I know there may have been some additional people to join us. If anyone is from a prison or a jail, you are likely already familiar with these requirements. However, for victim services agencies that are joining us, this may be new information. I encourage you to read and review the standards, but for our discussion today, I'm providing just an overview of these requirements. It's important for victim advocates to understand the standards so they can talk with survivors in confinement settings about what the facility or agency is required to do to be in compliance with the standards. Like we've said before, the ultimate goal is to prevent sexual abuse from happening in the first place. This is accomplished in multiple ways. Training and education of staff and prisoners are key. Staff need to know and understand the dynamics of sexual abuse and confinement. Inmates need to know about their right to be free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment, what to do if something happens, and the facility's response should an incident occur. Facilities are required to screen prisoners to determine their risk of sexual victimization and sexual perpetration when they first enter the facility. This information is used to make informed decisions about housing, bed, programming, work, and educational placements to ensure safety for all prisoners. Unfortunately, sexual abuse and sexual harassment continue to occur. The standards also require that facilities protect survivors who report sexual abuse, who report sexual abuse and sexual harassment, as well as witnesses, both staff and inmates, who cooperate in sexual abuse or sexual harassment investigations, that they are protected from being retaliated against. If an incident should occur, it is important that the facility have multiple ways to report. The idea being that with multiple ways to report, a survivor will have at least one way that they trust and feel comfortable reporting. There needs to be multiple internal ways to report to staff, volunteers, or contractors, or in writing. Many facilities now even have computer kiosks or tablets that prisoners can use to make a report. There also needs to be at least one way to report that is external to the facility, such as an external law enforcement agency or other such entity that is willing to accept these reports and forward the information on to the facility for an investigation. Facilities want to know that something has happened. In order for an investigation to occur, the facility has to know that something has happened. While facilities want to know as much as possible about an event, survivors need to also be able to report anonymously. Even with this information, an investigation will be initiated. Additionally, facilities need to provide ways for third parties, like friends or loved ones, to report on behalf of the inmate. The various reporting options are often confused, and we will spend an entire webinar, the fourth in the series, to tease apart the various reporting requirements and how they differ from the role that victim advocates provide. Medical and mental health care is also critical to the survivor's immediate and long-term healing. For example, during the sexual abuse, the victim may suffer injuries that need medical attention. They may also be exposed to sexually transmitted infections, or females may even become pregnant, all requiring long-term care. For incidents that occurred recently, facilities must offer a sexual assault forensic medical examination to survivors in order to collect forensic evidence to assist with the investigation. In our next webinar, we will talk in detail about trauma and the short and long-term impact of trauma on the brain. The need for mental health care is also critical to a survivor's ability to heal. All of the medical and mental health services provided as a result of sexual abuse must be provided at no cost to the survivor. Lastly, the standards require that all reports be taken seriously and investigated. The investigations must be prompt, thorough, and objective. It does not matter when the incident occurred. Even if it was months or years ago, it must be investigated by investigators who had been trained to conduct sexual abuse investigations in confinement settings. Perpetrators, whether inmates or staff, must be held accountable. Substantiated investigations, that is, investigations that were determined that the incident occurred, must be referred for prosecution. Incidents that are not criminal but administrative, so for example, an incident that occurred due to staff neglect or an incident of sexual harassment, must also be dealt with according to facility or agency policy. All incidents, substantiated or unsubstantiated, which means that not enough information was available to make a determination that it occurred or did not occur, must be reviewed to determine if there were factors involved that could be addressed to prevent a future incident from happening. I'm going to turn things back over to Lisa, who will talk specifically about the victim services standards. Lisa?
Thank you, Tara. At this point, it's my privilege to introduce Ms. Melinda Ingram, and I'd like to interview her with some stories from the field. We'd like to hear her voice. I want to remind you that if you do have any questions for Melinda specifically, please feel free to add that into that Zoom webinar chat, okay? Melinda? Melinda, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me, Lisa?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So thank you for being with us today. Can you tell us about the Mecklenburg County Jail and your role at the facility and how long you've been there?
Absolutely. The Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office, we actually operate two facilities, the Mecklenburg County Detention Center Central and the Mecklenburg County Juvenile Detention Center. We are the largest municipal detention center in North and South Carolina. We are a pre-trial facility that can house over 1,900 residents in our adult facility and over 70 juveniles, and I want to say it's about 72 in our juvenile detention center. I am the current PREA compliance manager for the Macon County Detention Center Central. I have been employed with the agency for approximately 15 years, and I've been the compliance manager for just a little over 3 weeks. And although I've been the PREA compliance manager for a short period of time, I'm not new to PREA by all means. I've been very instrumental in helping to implement PREA for our agency since the Sheriff's Office started implementing PREA in 2015.
Great, thank you so much, Melinda. And when you're thinking about the PREA standards, can you tell us about Mecklenburg County's efforts to implement the standards and how long the agency has been working on it?
Absolutely. Our agency first started working on PREA in 2015, and we held our first PREA audit in 2016, and we just recently completed our reaccreditation audit this past October. And as an agency, we recognize the importance of those PREA standards, and that's why we immediately implemented in-person training for all Sheriff's Office personnel, along with our contractors and volunteers. So not only do our staff need to be trained, but our residents need to be trained as well. We reached out to our local rape crisis center here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and developed a relationship with them. Basically, Lisa, we just wanted to hit the ground running and be the difference in our community.
That sounds amazing. So why is the agency itself committed to being compliant?
Well, safety and security is first and foremost at the Macon County Sheriff's Office, but the bottom line is everyone deserves to feel safe in any type of setting, whether you're a resident in a detention center or whether you're staff. And that's everyone's responsibility. With the PREA standards, it allowed us to take that important step towards changing culture within institutions, one from where victims are blamed to one where survivors are treated with dignity and respect.
Thank you. Did you find in that process that there were any particular challenges that you'd like to share with us about getting staff buy-in and maybe a little bit about how to overcome those challenges?
Well, honestly, there were times when we had individuals from our agency that strongly expressed that they felt that we were just taking things too far. And as that individual who was standing up in front of them, providing instruction on the importance of PREA and the standards, it was important that I convey the message that everyone is one mistake away from being arrested, and every resident is someone's mother, father, sister, brother, and the same dignity and respect that you want for your loved ones, that they have someone who wants the same for them. And Lisa, and at the end of the day, a crime is a crime and a victim is the victim. No matter who you are or where it occurs, it's a crime and it is against the law.
Yes, thank you so much for emphasizing that. And could you tell us, I know you've mentioned it already, but who Mecklenburg County partners with on their community-based advocacy organization to provide services for, and I believe, I'm not sure we went over this, but your jail does call them residents, correct?
Yes, we do. And I know the PREA standards are very clear on defining under the prison and jail standards of inmates, but we do call them residents. We do feel that we are part of the community and they are as well. So therefore, we call them residents versus inmates. We do partner with Safe Alliance Rape Crisis Center to provide our crisis intervention and emotional support services to our residents of sexual abuse via the phone resident system. They're able to write letters and or hospital accompaniment.
Great. How do you think that's really benefited your agency, that relationship that you have?
Well, when we have Safe Alliance, our residents are able to pick the phones up in the housing unit, dial *25, and it takes them directly to a trained victim advocate. They also have that option to write them as well. And before COVID-19, there was an option for individuals to come inside the detention center, but we have since stopped all in-person services.
Okay, thank you. Now, what advice would you give to jails across North Carolina that are looking to establish a similar partnership with their advocacy programs within their community?
I would have to say that you want to get to know your local rape crisis center and build a working relationship with them. It's all about relationship building, and that takes time. You want to develop some cross-agency training opportunities. Let them see how your facility operates, the resident population, and how facility operation might affect their response to sexual assault. You have to figure out what services an organization can provide because it might not match what you need.
That sounds great. And I know we do have the majority of individuals on our webinar today are rape crisis centers. What kind of advice would you give them when they're looking to forge a relationship with their local jail and establish a partnership?
Well, Lisa, they also want to get to know their local detention facility. I know we're facing COVID-19 right now, but if you're able, you want to tour that local detention facility. It's important for you to understand the facility, the programs and services available, as well as the living situation for these residents. This will help you as an advocate to tailor the services that you provide.
Thank you so much, Melinda. That's all really helpful information. I do want to give an opportunity just in case anyone does have any questions for Melinda. If you do have any specific questions and you don't get them in this moment in the chat box, you can always add those later on and we can get those answered for you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Melinda. Okay, without any questions, it looks like I'm going to continue on with victim services with the PREA standards. Our last topic today focuses on PREA victim services standards. So like we've mentioned before in this webinar, we're aiming to provide guidance on how to take these standards and put them into practice. You'll notice on the slide that there are several photos. These are survivors of sexual abuse and confinement who have shared their story with JDI, many of whom are part of JDI's Survival Council, who works with JDI to advise them on their work. Now, there are three primary standards that are specific to victim services. We have 115.21, which is the evidence protocol and forensic medical examinations. 115.53, inmate access to outside confidential support services. And 115.401, frequency and scope of audits. As I mentioned earlier, we'll talk in another webinar about the reporting standards specifically and whether or not those are for victim service providers or not. Not to confuse things today, we're just going to focus on those standards that are explicit about partnering with victim service agencies. Today we'll talk about the first two standards in more detail. We'll get to the second to last webinar in this series, and we'll talk about that in more detail and really tease it out. The audit is a requirement of the standards whereby an independent auditor is contracted with the facility to determine whether or not they are in compliance with the standards. There are standards that govern the audit, and provision O of standard 115.401 talks about an auditor's attempts to communicate with community-based or victim advocates about insight they have into the relevant conditions of the facility they're auditing. Now, standard 115.21 and 115.53 impact provision of victim services each and every day of the facility, excuse me. 115.21 is the standard for the evidence protocol and forensic medical examinations. And I'm going to share a portion of the standards that are relevant to victim services. So subsection C says the agency shall offer all victims of sexual abuse access to forensic medical examinations, whether on site or at an outside facility, without financial cost, where evidentiarily or medically appropriate. Such examinations shall be performed by sexual assault forensic examiners, SAFEs, or sexual assault nurse examiners, SANEs, where possible. Subsection D says the agency shall attempt to make available to the victim a victim advocate from a rape crisis center. If a rape crisis center is not available to provide victim advocate services, the agency shall make available to provide these services a qualified staff member from a community-based organization or a qualified agency staff member. Agencies shall document efforts to secure services from rape crisis centers. And subsection E says, as requested by the victim advocate, qualified agency staff member, or qualified community-based organization staff member shall accompany and support the victim through the forensic medical examination process and investigatory interviews, and shall provide emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referrals. Now, Standard 115.53 is called Inmate Access to Outside Confidential Support Services. Subsection A says the facility shall provide inmates with access to outside victim advocates for emotional support services related to sexual abuse by giving inmates mailing addresses and telephone numbers, including toll-free hotline numbers where available, of local, state, or national victim advocacy or rape crisis agencies. And for persons detained solely for civil immigration purposes, immigrant services agencies. The facility shall enable reasonable communication between inmates and these organizations and agencies in as confidential a manner as possible. Subsection B says the facility shall inform inmates prior to giving them access of the extent to which such communications will be monitored and the extent to which reports of abuse will be forwarded to authorities in accordance with mandatory reporting laws. And subsection, and last, subsection C says the agency shall maintain or attempt to enter in a memoranda of understanding or other agreements with community service providers that are able to provide inmates with confidential emotional support services related to sexual abuse. The agency shall maintain copies of agreements or documentation showing attempts to enter into such agreements. All right, so I've just shared a lot of information about just 2 standards. I know I went into a lot of specific subsections, and you heard the language is very specific, detailed, and complicated. In coming webinars, we will tease apart the language in these standards and talk concretely about what these requirements look like in practice. One thing I hope you take away from today's webinar is this slide. The standards require that survivors have access to victim advocates at various times. These include those inmates who report abuse. They have the right to an advocate during the forensic exam, investigator interviews, and ongoing emotional support. Access to an advocate is not limited to those who report. In fact, in the community, it has been shown that victims of sexual abuse who have not reported but have been able to talk with an advocate who provides them with information, allowing them to decide the best course of action for themselves, actually sees an increase in reporting following discussions with advocates. The PREA standards not only allow survivors to have access to an advocate for emotional support, whether or not they have reported sexual abuse, it is also a service that is available to all survivors of sexual abuse and is not limited to sexual abuse that occurred in confinement, but at any time in their lives or place.
Gabriella, we're now at the Q&A portion.
Okay, so you all are welcome to type in any questions you may have in the chat box. We will also take them in the question and answer section as well.
I know we had a question early on about how the present situation in our country impacts incarcerated folks and how it may increase their risk for sexual violence. I know that was at the very beginning, and I don't want to assume, but whoever had asked that question, is that in response to the present situation of COVID and quarantine?
I think if you want, Lisa, you could go ahead and answer from that
I think, yes, I will say, oh, George Floyd, okay, etc. So maybe COVID which is a big and I know Tara definitely, and I have had conversations about how quarantine is impacting everyone specifically. I know Melinda mentioned with her facility, it's difficult. They're not doing in-person support, which has been a big change. And Melinda, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But it is something that most facilities are having to approach. So with respect to COVID, we are having to get a bit more creative, and it's not an opportunity where we have to use Zoom or things of that nature inside a facility. So I think now is just really, it's very important to make sure you have that relationship with your facility and really look at different opportunities you have to provide for support and help encourage, you know, that reporting and just the overall sexual safety of the facility. Tara, do you have any responses on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think as JDI, we get a lot of letters from survivors. We've certainly seen a decrease in the letters. Not only, like Lisa said, are visitors and advocates and stuff not being allowed into facilities, there's also been concern about people being able to communicate out. And so, you know, because of risk of, you know, facilities wanting to prevent transmission of the virus within a facility, we've heard about restrictions on telephone use. We have heard that many prisons and jails contract for their phone services. There are some big companies nationally that provide that. And what we've heard is that many of those are providing to all inmates, I think it's like 2 free phone calls. I think it's a week. I could be mistaken on the details on that. JDI is hosting a webinar. We've already done one, and we're going to have another one next week, next Tuesday, that is specific about, you know, looking at the response and providing of services to incarcerated individuals during the time of COVID. So we could certainly provide that information to NC CASA if anyone is interested in participating in that. Certainly we are concerned about, because of the greater, you know, the facilities across the nation are short-staffed, and if staff are getting sick or they're not showing up to work for whatever reason, that puts an even greater strain on the facility and safety and security. We've also heard of a lot of jurisdictions that are not just preventing, you know, visitors and such from coming into facilities, but are also locking down inmates, so keeping them on their housing units or even keeping them in their cells, and absolutely concerned about making sure that you know, that they are safe from sexual abuse in those situations, and that they have the ability to still interact with staff or the other reporting mechanisms should something occur.
Right. I'm not sure if I answered one of the first questions we got, which was, with COVID-19, do you think reporting will be affected? So if that didn't fully answer your question, please get back to us and we'll circle back to that. I'm going to go on to the next question. How do you think, if any, raise the age has impacted juvenile settings? Interested in hearing Melinda's perspective if she is still on the call.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes, with Raise the Age, which took effect December 1, our facility went from where we had our 16 and 17-year-olds at our North facility. They were there. We had a unit that was specific to them. When Raise the Age came into play, we moved some of our adult residents out and moved them uptown. So now we're able to start housing starting at 15 years old. So we're starting over, so to speak. We have always been but now.
Oh, Melinda, you're breaking up. Let's give Melinda a minute.
A lot of them.
Oh, it's okay, Melinda, you were breaking up.
Oh, I'm sorry. And
it's
now
okay.
We have the other ones. Whether you believe it or not, a lot of our juveniles that are coming in, they're familiar with PREA, which is a good thing. So we're able to stress the importance of allowing them to be free from retaliation and reporting mechanisms, but we were very surprised that a lot of them are already familiar with it.
Great. And I was going to say that, you know, something else just for folks on the line is that one of the standards in the PREA standards under the adult prison and jail standards is around protection of youthful inmates. And a youthful inmate is anyone under the age of 18. And the standard says that they have to be sight and sound separated from individuals who are over the age 18 or older. And what we find around the nation is that this is a very, very difficult thing to comply with. You can have someone sight separated. That's fairly easy to do. It's the sound separation that is very, very challenging. Now, that's during sleeping hours. During the day, during programming, as long as there's direct staff supervision, youthful inmates, again, those that are under the age of 18, can be in programming or in work assignments with people who are 18 and older, but it does present a lot of complications for jurisdictions. And I have seen around the nation that, you know, definitely a push in addition to, you know, law changes and things to try to get those individuals, you know, those youthful inmates out of adult facilities and into juvenile detention facilities, if at all possible.
Great. So our next question is, are you aware of any retaliation reports toward those who report abuse?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't have specific numbers of retaliation, but it is absolutely why that standard exists, is that not only, you know, if I should report that I've been sexually abused, but anyone, you know, any witnesses, whether they be staff or inmates that participate in an investigation, even staff who report on fellow staff if there's been sexual misconduct going on. We've certainly heard stories from those individuals about retaliation happening. And so the facilities are required, anyone who's involved in the investigation, whether it be the survivor or other witnesses, whether they be prisoners or staff, that they be monitored for retaliation for at least 90 days. And the reason being, and to pay attention to not just ask someone, hey, are you being retaliated against, but to also look at other things. Are there, you know, has a work performance or a work review been done in that period of time? And is it a very drastic outcome from what maybe they've had in the past? Are they being reassigned to different shifts than what they typically work? Are inmates facing disciplinary charges in a certain way? Or are there other observations that staff are making that would indicate that there's some kind of retaliation going on?
And our next one, can you please share what the PREA standards say around juvenile education as it relates to confidential support services, such as the time period they should be educated on PREA?
Sure. So like was mentioned, that the standards apply to all confinement facilities. There are different sets of standards. There's a set of standards for adult prisons and jails, one for juvenile detention, one for community confinement, and then one for lockups. And there are some variations. Specific to, well, this is true for anyone. When they first come into the facility, within 72 hours, they are supposed to get, or, you know, during the intake process, a basic education on PREA, their right to be free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment. They're also supposed to be told, you know, how to report, so real basic information. Then for juveniles in a juvenile detention setting, within 10 days, they have to get a more comprehensive education. And during that time, everything that was reviewed during intake will be reemphasized, as well as, you know, access to confidential support services. You know, again, reiterating how to make a report, what happens should, you know, if they make a report, what does the investigative process look like, those kinds of things. So again, within 10 days, that comprehensive education. On the flip side, for adults, that education has to occur within 30 days. And you may be wondering, why is there the difference? And the reason being is that on the adult side, those standards govern both prisons and jails. And as you may recall, early on in today's webinar, Lisa talked about the differences between prisons and jails. And again, jails, people are coming in and leaving the facility constantly. There's a lot of, turnover in the population. And the vast majority of people will actually be gone from the facility within 30 days. And the thinking being, it was a concession that was made when the standards came out, that, it was too much of a time crunch to try to get a comprehensive education done faster in a jail. And so they extended that to 30 days. But most jurisdictions tend to do it within like 10 to 15 days has been my experience. And then one last thought, and then we can move on to other questions. The reason it's also a bifurcated or like a two-part education is that when someone's first coming in, especially if someone's coming in straight off the streets into a local jail, they may be intoxicated, they may be high, they may be decompensating in some way. And it's just, regardless of any of those things, it's going to be a shock to the system. And so they're already getting a lot of information thrown at them, and it's too much to expect someone to retain all the information that you want to share when they first come to a facility. So you give them what they need to know about their right to be free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment and how to report, and then re-emphasize that information as things have kind of calmed down at a later date.
All right, so we have 5 minutes left, and there is another question. As an advocate, we have been contacted by the local jail and told that it is mandatory that we provide confidential support services to their prisoners. Unfortunately, we are a small organization with limited staff capacity. What do you recommend we do?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to emphasize what Melinda said earlier, that it is a relationship and that relationships do take time to build. And this is not an uncommon thing that we have heard where, they call up, someone gets a call and says, you have to do this for us. And we've also heard on the flip side where advocates have called the local jail and said, okay, we are going to, this is what we're going to provide for you. And I just want to, before I go on, Robin has mentioned in the chat, definitely check with NC CASA. Absolutely. They are your state resource for all things PREA, and I encourage you to reach out to them. But also it is a negotiated process. So, as Melinda mentioned that before COVID, that they had advocates coming in and providing in-person services. A smaller agency may not be able to do that, and that's okay. The PREA standards say that that as best as possible, some kind of agreement be established with a victim services agency. And it can be, taking phone calls, but maybe they can't do that. Maybe it's of, receiving letters and responding to those. And if that's not an option, again, NC CASA is here to help you navigate that, and that there are other options probably within the state of North Carolina and nationally that could be looked at as well.
Okay, it looks like we have one more question from a corrections facility. We do not have a rape crisis center in our jurisdiction. Our agency has officers trained as care support people. Do we still need to try and find an outside agency to provide confidential support services?
The short answer is yes. Again, like was mentioned before, definitely check with NC CASA to help you there, because we recognize that there are small jurisdictions throughout the state of North Carolina, and NC CASA can certainly help you navigate that. But just while the standards say that officers, first of all, attempts have to be made to enter into some kind of an agreement with victim advocates to provide services. And after attempts, and later in the series, we will have a webinar just on the MOU, so establishing an agreement, and we'll talk through this in more detail. You can't just make one phone call and that be done. You do have to make attempts and be able to document those attempts for an auditor. And then it's only at that point could, if none of that is possible, then it is, and if NC CASA doesn't have any other options for you, then it's an opportunity, or that's a time when staff could serve in a limited capacity to support those individuals. But it would not be in the same way that a victim advocate would, and would not be a replacement for the confidential support services that are mentioned in the one standard.
All right, it looks like that is all the questions.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for coming and participating. For additional information, you can contact Just Detention International using the information that I think is going to be on one of the next slides. These are upcoming webinars with a link to register for them. They're on our website. If you go to the next slide, Tara.
There we go.
Oh yeah, those are additional resources, and we will be posting this webinar online as well, and I will be sending everybody the link. Next slide. Make sure to go onto our NC CASA website to sign up for the rest of these webinars that will also be in our member mailing this Thursday as well. And everybody that attended today will be receiving a certificate for attending this webinar. You can receive a certificate for every single one of the PREA webinars, and you will receive the link to sign up for that at the end of the month. For additional information, please go to the JDI website and direct questions to advocate@justdetention.org. And also, please check in with NC CASA, Robin at nccasa.org or Courtney at nccasa.org. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Tara, Lisa, and Melinda for being here and giving us all of your knowledge on this subject.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.